Hey guys, it's Maddie. Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, then welcome. Today I'll be doing my July wrap-up. So I'm going to start off by saying I had a fantastic reading month. I read 15 books. I surpassed my record of 14 books that I've had since June of 2015. So I beat my record for most books read in a month, and I'm so happy. I'm still just blown away by that. Granted, I did read some short books this month. I read a few novellas and one short story and one children's book, but I'm still counting it. Still, I'm so happy about that. That is just amazing. So I'm very excited to talk about the books I read this month. I read some not so great books. I actually have, I think, 2 one-star books, and that never happens, but I also read some great ones. So I'm going to do this wrap-up a little differently. Usually I talk about my stats at the beginning of the video. I've decided here on out that I want to talk about them at the end of the video, since I know that's probably not something that everyone wants to see, and that you're really here for the actual books that I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to start talking about the stats at the end of the video. Just in case you don't want to see the stats, you can just click out of the video early if you don't want to see them. So with that said, let's just get into the books that I read in July. First, I'm going to talk about the books that I did not finish. So I have 3 books that I DNF'd. 2 of them I don't plan to continue. 1 of them I do plan to continue, I just didn't finish it in time before July was over. So the first book I have, and one that I don't plan to continue, is The King of Bourbon Street. This is a new adult book that I plan to read because it was part of the Book Hangover book club that is hosted by Chelsea Darling Reads and Pages and Pens on YouTube. So I wanted to join in their live show for this. I started it, I got 3 chapters in, and then figured out that I'm not really interested. The thing about this book is that the writing style wasn't for me. I wasn't getting into it. And even though I was 3 chapters in, I just didn't feel like I was going to like this one. So I just decided, you know what, I'm just gonna DNF it. Even though I really wanted to participate in this book club, but I can always read the next book read for this club, and hopefully I will actually like the next book. This one was just a dud for me. And the next one that I DNF'd and don't plan to continue on with was actually the book I picked in my last try chapter pick, so this was kind of a surprise for me at least. And that was Wicked Lovely by Melissa Marr. I got pretty far into this one. I got to chapter 8 or 9, so I was doing good, and I obviously loved the first chapter because I read the first chapter of this book for my try chapter tag, which means that I liked it because I picked it. But as the book went on, it just started to drag. Nothing was happening. I was almost 100 pages in and nothing was happening. I was like, okay, when is something going to happen? I kept reading on, just waiting and waiting, and nothing was happening. And also, all the information that was being given was super vague, and I just did not have the patience for that. So I was like, I'm just gonna DNF it, not interested, which I was really sad about because, of course, I want to read and love my try chapter picks. But with this one, it just wasn't working for me, so that was disappointing. And the next book I DNF'd, but I do plan to continue on with, is Pure by Jennifer L. Armentrout. This is the second book in the Covenant series. I read the first book this month, which I will talk about later on in this wrap-up, but spoiler alert, I liked the first book, so I decided to continue on with the second book, but I didn't get to finish it in time before July was over, so I'm going to move it on to August, and I'm really looking forward to continue reading it. Now going into my rereads, so I reread 3 books this month. The first one is The Unexpected Everything by Morgan Matson. I first read this book in summer of 2016, and I just felt like rereading it again. So I decided to pick it up and thought it was the perfect time to do so because this is a book that takes place in summer, and it currently is summer, so I thought if I'm going to reread it, it has to be now. This book is so cute. I remembered exactly why I loved it so much, though I have to say, the second time around that I read it, I actually didn't love it as much as the first time I read it. The first time I read it, I gave it 5 stars. But the second time I read it, I gave it 4 stars. And that is because I felt like with the second time I read it, the pacing seemed a little off to me, and that's not something I noticed before, but that really goes to show how much more critical I've gotten with my reading, because I feel like I definitely have, and now I can really see it, because the first time I read this book, I read it without over analyzing everything, but I read it with more of a critical mindset the second time around, which unfortunately made me not love the book as much as I did the first time. But even so, I still enjoyed it. I love the characters, I love romance, and the love interest is one of my favorite love interests ever. He is so adorable. So I would still recommend this one, especially it is a great one to read during the summertime. And my other 2 rereads were Obsidian and Onyx by Jennifer L. Armentrout, which is the first and second book in the Lux series. If you keep up with my channel and have seen my more recent videos, you may be thinking, didn't you already read these books like not that long ago? To that I say yes, I did. But here's the deal. I forgot almost everything that happened in these books. What I've come to find out when it comes to series is that I forget what happens in the previous book so easily. And because of that, I've decided that when it comes to me currently reading series, I have to read the next book ASAP. It has to be my top priority, because if it's been like more than a month since I've read the last book, if I go into the next book, I will get so frustrated because I'm like, I don't remember what happened in the first book. I don't know what's going on. So really what I have to do now is basically binge read series so that this doesn't happen ever again. And this is what happened with the Lux series. I had to reread the first 2 books before I could go on to the next books. So that is why I reread these books, even though I just read them 3 months ago. But now I'm reminded of everything and I can finally get into Opal, the next book, which I'm really, really excited for. And as for the summary of these books, this series is about a girl who moves into a new town and finds out that her next door neighbors are aliens. So it's kind of like a sci-fi paranormal series. It's pretty popular even though it came out quite a few years ago, but I would highly recommend it even though it's an older series. It is so good. I'm so excited to finally continue on with the rest of the books in this series. And I gave Obsidian 5 stars and the second book 4 stars. Okay, now going into the rest of the books that I read in July, I will be sharing these books in order from my least favorite book to my most favorite book of the month. So let's just get into it. Coming in as my least favorite book of the month and one of the worst books I've read this year, that is Beautiful Disaster. Oh my god, this book was so terrible. It was so bad. And I know some people like it, but I know there are a lot of people who absolutely despise this book, so I don't feel as bad. As for the summary of this book, if I can even remember what it's about this girl who meets this guy and he's like a wrestler. And they start off this friendship which eventually forms into this relationship, and they're in college, and that's about it. It's a very basic storyline. So the reason why I absolutely hated this book is that it romanticizes an abusive relationship, which is totally not okay with me. And at first I was kind of forgiving of that because the point of this book is that it's supposed to be about an unhealthy relationship. So at first I was kind of like, okay, I get that this is the point of the book, but at the same time, as I got into the latter part of this book, I was starting to feel like the abusive relationship was actually being condoned. There was a lot of evidence, at least to me, that that was the case. Basically, the way the love interest acts is that he would get very possessive over the main character. He would tell her that she can't dress in certain clothes because other guys were going to look at her. So he would make her change out of her outfit, and that pissed me off so much. He was also physically abusive to his friends. At one point, she leaves him and he just goes berserk. He trashes his apartment. He hits his roommate because she left him, and I was like, this is not okay. This is not okay. It made me feel so uncomfortable. And I have to say, this book actually terrified me for the fact that this was an abusive relationship. So if you can't tell, I hated this book. I don't think it sends a good message to any young woman that this is what a relationship looks like, and also I feel like it really makes a bad impression on guys who might read this, because they might think like this is how you should treat a woman. This is not how you should treat a girl at all. So I'm just hoping that girls and guys see this as fiction and that they recognize that this is an unhealthy relationship. So yes, hated this book. Also, the writing was really bad. It was really cringy. It was honestly just a big waste of time, and I gave it 1 star. Okay, going on to another 1-star book. That is Milk and Vine. This is a parody of the poetry collection Milk and Honey, and I read Milk and Honey this month, which I will talk about in a little bit. And I saw this book and I was like, I'm gonna give it a try. This book is a parody of Milk and Honey that features classic Vine quotes. And when Vine was out, I absolutely loved that app. I used it all the time. And I was very familiar with certain Viners and certain Vines. So I was like, I'm gonna give this a try. And it really wasn't great. Going into this book, I was expecting that there would be some creative use of the vines, but instead this book is basically quotes from a vine and then just a random drawing. And what bothered me most was that the original viners who made these vines were not credited in the book, and that really bothered me because I felt like the viners should have been credited. So that was also a reason why I really didn't like it. So I give this one 1 star. I didn't expect to love it, but I didn't expect to dislike it either, so it was really disappointing. Next is a children's book I actually decided to pick up. I was doing a readathon called the 7 and 7 readathon, where you have to read 7 books in 7 days, and I was running out of time because it was nearing the end of the readathon, so I'm like, I just need something quick. So I decided to pick up a children's book, and I picked up Goodnight Moon. So I am familiar with Goodnight Moon. It is a children's classic that I read when I was younger, so I was like, I'm just gonna read it again. Why not? It's like a few pages, and each page has like 4 words on it. So I definitely like flew through it. This is a children's book about a rabbit who is about to go to bed, and he's saying goodnight to all the things in his room. It is really cute. I gave it 3 stars. The thing with children's books is that I don't exactly know how to rate them, because I rate books based on plot and characters and writing. But in Goodnight Moon, there's no plot. There's one character. You don't get any character development because it's just a rabbit saying goodnight to his things in his room. But I did think it was an okay book, so I gave it 3 stars. Funny thing, so I was looking up reviews on Goodreads after I read this book, and some of the reviews were marked as spoilers, and I'm like, what about this book is a spoiler? This book doesn't have a plot, so how could there be any spoilers? I don't really understand that. Spoiler alert, at the end of the book, he says goodnight to the old lady saying hush hush. That's the spoiler? I don't really get it. I don't get why there were some spoiler marks on Goodreads from this book. It really cracked me up. But anyway, I did really enjoy it. It's definitely like a great classic book that I would recommend to read to your children if you have any. Next, I read my first poetry collection, which was really cool, and that was Milk and Honey. I really wanted to give poetry a try, and I know that this is one of the biggest modern poetry collections as of right now, so I decided to pick it up, and I thought it was okay. Milk and Honey is full of poems about love, loss, heartbreak, growing up, all of that kinds of stuff. The thing with this one is that I liked some of the poems. I thought they were very beautiful, but then there were some pages where there would be 2 sentences, and I was like, how does this count as a poem? And I'm not sure if that's just me because I'm not very familiar with poetry yet, and I'm not sure if this is like how a standard poem works nowadays, but I feel like a poem needs to be more than just a sentence, because I feel like when it's just a sentence or 2, that's basically just a quote. And some of the like 1 sentence poems on a page felt so generic. Like it would say things and I'd be like, yeah, like I haven't heard about that before, duh. So I was like, this isn't anything new. And I feel like with poems, I want to get a new feeling from them. But like I said, this book did have some longer poems that I really enjoyed. I felt like the author had such an elegant way of writing, and I do want to pick up her other poetry collection, which is The Sun and Her Flowers. Hopefully I'll like it more than Milk and Honey. But I feel like with Milk and Honey, it was just an okay poetry collection that I gave 3 stars. However, I do still plan to pick up more poetry collections, and hopefully I'll find one that I fall in love with. Next, I read a novella, which is a prequel novella to a series, and that is Demon by Jennifer L. Armentrout. So I plan to read Half-Blood, which is the first book in this series, because it was my TBR book pick for this month. But then while I was looking at the book on Goodreads and the whole series on Goodreads, I found out that it has a prequel novella to it that you're supposed to read before reading the first book. So I actually decided to pick up the prequel novella before I went into the first book, and I'm so glad I did, because this novella had so much vital information that you really need to know before you go into the series. So I'm really glad that I read it. I gave it 4 stars. It was a great introduction to this series. And then after that, I picked up the official first book in the series, which is Half-Blood, and I thought it was a great first book in the series. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I didn't think it was amazing, and I found myself, unfortunately, comparing it a lot to the Lux series, since they are both paranormal series. And in comparison with the Lux series, I don't think that the Covenant series is as good as that one. However, I like how the story is going. Based on that fact, I'm really looking forward to continuing on with the rest of the books in this series. Currently, I am reading the second book, and so far it's going really good. I really love the characters. There is one character in this book named Seth that I absolutely love. He reminds me so much of Damon from the Lux series. They have very similar personality traits, and I love Damon, so of course I'm gonna love Seth because he's very similar to him. And I plan to continue on reading the series in August, and hopefully I'll love the rest of the books. Next, I read another Jennifer L. Armentrout book. This is a new adult book of hers, and that is Tempting the Best Man. This was a great one. I really enjoyed it. I really like how Jennifer dives into the new adult genre. This was her first new adult book, so it was really cool to see her first foray into the new adult world. I really love the romance because it follows the trope where it is the friends to lovers romance, and I love that trope, and I felt like that trope was done well in this book. The only negative thing I have about this book, and it contains one of my biggest pet peeves, and that is miscommunications. Jennifer, I love you, but this is the second new adult book by you that has had the miscommunications trope. I hate that trope so much, where the 2 main characters don't talk something through and they get misinformation towards each other, and then they don't take the time to solve it. I'm like, just talk to each other. Just talk. It drives me absolutely insane. This book probably would have been a 5-star had the miscommunications thing not been in there, so I was disappointed by that. Everything else, though, was good. I liked how the romance played out. It was very swoon-worthy, and I really loved the love interest. He was very interesting, and I really liked his backstory and how that's affecting their relationship. And this book was so gripping that I read it in 1 sitting. And let me just tell you, I never read books in 1 sitting. Even though this book was only a little over 200 pages, that's still a lot for me to read in 1 sitting. So that was really cool. I finished this book in 1 night, finished it really quickly. And then I did go on to the second book in the series, because this is the first book in a companion trilogy. But I finished the second book in August, and as of right now, it's August 2nd. I finished the second book at 3 in the morning because I didn't want to put it down. So I will talk about the second book in my August wrap-up. But I really liked the first book. It gave it 4 stars, and would really recommend this trilogy. It is very not well known. It's not her most popular series ever, but I really enjoyed it. And the next book I have is A Quiet Kind of Thunder by Sarah Bernard. This is a book about a girl who is a selective mute, which means in some social situations, she can't talk at all because her anxiety gets so bad. She meets this boy who is new to her school and he is deaf. And since she knows some sign language, she is able to communicate with him. They start off this friendship which grows into this amazing love story. I love this book and found it so relatable to me personally because, as I've mentioned before, I do have social anxiety, so all the things that the main character was going through, I just really related to, and the feelings she had were just so real and just spoke to me so much. There were so many quotes throughout this book that I underlined because I'm like, yes, that is me exactly. I felt like this book had all the thoughts that have been going through my head, especially recently, that it was like kind of scary, but that's how relatable it was to me. And I also love the love interest. He was so adorable. I'm very familiar with the deaf community because I took 2 years of ASL in high school, so I do know a bit of sign language, even though I'm really rusty because it's been a while. So that's another reason why I connected with this book so much. And I found Reese, the deaf boy, in this book to be so adorable. He was so sweet to Steffi, the main character. The only thing that I didn't love about this book is that I felt like the pacing was really weird. There would be some scenes that were glossed over, and at times I felt like it was going too fast. So that was the only bad thing I had about this book. But I loved everything else. I loved the romance. I loved how it played out. It was so easy to fall in love with Steffi and Reese's relationship because they really just worked together. So if you love sweet YA contemporaries and also want to read a book about a deaf character and a book that features sign language in it, I would highly recommend this one. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read The Wicked Deep by Shay Earnshaw. This book had been on my TBR ever since it came out. I had been dying to read it. I finally picked it up and I really did enjoy it. Based on the summary alone, you get the sense that this is going to be a very eerie and creepy book. It definitely was, and I have to say the atmosphere of the book is the best part about it. It is written in a way that makes you easily visualize the whole town. When it comes to books, I often have a hard time visualizing settings, but this book, the way it was told, I could just easily envision the ocean, the town, the island that the main character lives on so perfectly. I also love the plot of the book. I liked how it was going. I didn't for once feel like it was too slow. Maybe in the beginning it was a little slow, but it did pick up really quickly. The one downfall of this book though is the characters. I felt like especially the side characters didn't get enough attention, and some characters were mentioned and then never brought up again, and it made me wonder why these characters were mentioned in the first place because they just felt kind of useless. And I even felt like the main characters could have been developed a little bit more. This book didn't really pick up for me. I didn't get really invested into it until like the halfway point of the book when a plot twist is introduced, and that changed the whole outlook I had on the book. From then on, I grew very interested in how things were going to turn out. Like, the plot twist just really made this book for me because it made what was happening in this book make so much more sense, and it made it so much more intriguing. And in regards to the romance, I again didn't fall in love with it until the halfway point when it all started to make sense, and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm living for this romance now, even though before then I was feeling that it was very mediocre. So fortunately the book did really pick up for me at the halfway point. But overall, I rated this book a 4 out of 5 stars. Really enjoyed it. I just wish the characters would have been developed a little bit more. I did film a review on this book, which will be coming out really soon, so you'll get to see all my in-depth thoughts about this book. Next book I picked up was a short story that was so ridiculous, but was so hilarious. So a booktuber and a member of AuthorTube wrote this short story, and I will link his channel below. That is at Wolfshop Publishing. I discovered him recently and I really love his videos. He did a video where he challenged himself to write and publish a book in 1 day, and after I saw that video I'm like, I'm really curious about this book. I feel like I really need to read it. So he did a satire on a bizarro erotic romance book, and it was just one of the best things I have ever read. So that book is Love Comes in 3. It is basically a parody of The Bachelor, but The Bachelor is choosing between 3 girls. One is just a regular human girl. The other one is a velociraptor. And the other one is The Daughter of Bigfoot. And it's all just an erotica about him choosing between these 3 girls and his individual date with each of these girls. I give this story 5 out of 5 stars because I just felt like it was done so well. And I also didn't look too much into it because I understood that it was supposed to be ridiculous. It's supposed to be satire. You're not supposed to take it seriously. So I didn't overanalyze it or anything. I just based my rating off of enjoyment alone. And what I actually loved about this book, thinking critically on it, is that the writing was really, really good. He wrote this book in one day without it being professionally edited. So he edited this book himself, and I did not see one typo in this book. Did not see one grammar mistake. The whole story flowed so easily, and I'm like, that is talent. And it made me actually want to pick up his actual books that he has published. He has a series published that I want to read even more in it because the writing in the story was so good, even though it was a satire story. Okay, we're almost done. I know this is a very, very, very long video. So next I read a prequel novella, and that is Before Tomorrow by Pintip Dunn, and this is the prequel to the Forget Tomorrow trilogy. I talk about this series a lot. I really, really love it, but I kept forgetting that there was a novella in this series. So I kept putting it off because I kept forgetting that it existed. But then I finally picked it up, and I really enjoyed it. I loved Logan throughout this series, so I was really excited to read a book from his point of view, and I really fell in love with his character even more in this novella. His character is just so endearing, he's so lovable, and I liked seeing him in this novella start to realize that the organization that organizes the future memory aspect is very, very flawed, and you can see him start to do something about it. If you have read this trilogy and if you are a fan, I would recommend to read the prequel novella. It is very much worth it. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Finally, the last book, which is my favorite book that I read this month, is another Jennifer L. Armentrout book. Yeah, no surprise there. That is Scorch. This is the companion novel to her first book, Frigid, which I read in June, which I liked, so I really wanted to read the second book. And let me tell you, I love the second book even more than the first book. In comparison to the first book, Frigid, Scorched is a lot more serious. It takes on a very deeper and more serious tone, and it goes over very hard-hitting subject matters. I will say that you shouldn't read this book if you are triggered by alcohol abuse and depression and anxiety, because that is the main focus of this book other than the romance. However, those aspects of this book are the reasons why I loved it so much. I could definitely relate to the anxiety part of it because, like I said earlier in this video, I have anxiety and it is hard, so I really related to the main character. Also loved how this book took on alcohol abuse, because with new adult books, the ones I've read so far, alcohol abuse and over drinking isn't something I've read about yet. So it's really cool and really refreshing to follow a character who has an addiction to alcohol. And I also love the romance in this book. This book has a hate to love romance in it, which I am all for because that's one of my favorite romance tropes. And throughout this whole book, you could just really feel the connection between Tanner and Andrea, and I was just rooting for them. And I loved how Tanner was there for Andrea, even though he didn't know what she was struggling with. He could only see that she was in a lot of pain, and he was still there for her. So he was a very, very caring guy. I give this one 5 out of 5 stars. My favorite book that I read this month. I finished it quickly because I just could not put it down. So those were all the books that I read in July. That was a lot, and I'm pretty sure this video is super long. So I'm gonna go right into the stats so we can keep this video as short as it can be. So as for the stats, I read, as I said in the beginning, 15 books this month, and I read a total of 3,361 pages. One book was released in 2015, 2 were released in 2016, 4 were released in 2011, there was 1 2014, 1 2012, 2 2018, 2 were released in 2017, and 1 was released in 1947. As for genres, I read 3 contemporary romances, 1 contemporary book, 1 urban fantasy, 4 paranormal books, 1 poetry, 2 comedies, 1 dystopian, and 1 children's book. I read 8 novels, 2 novellas, 2 poetry books, and 2 short stories. All the books that I read in July were ebooks. The first that's ever happened. I usually have a mix of ebooks and physical books. I read all ebooks this month because I've been getting more and more and more ebooks because I don't have room to buy physical books at this moment, which is sad. So I've just been sticking to ebooks. I read 1 book that was by a male author, the rest were by female authors. None of the books that I read this month were part of a series, and the rest were standalones. I read 2 new adult books, 8 young adult books, 3 adult books, and then there were a few that were like non-applicable. They're not really targeted to a specific audience. 3 of the books that I read this month were rereads. As for where the settings of the books were located, so Scorch was in West Virginia, The Unexpected Everything, US, The Wicked Deep, Oregon, Beautiful Disaster, US, A Quiet Kind of Thunder was in the UK, Demon was in Miami, Florida, Half-Blood was in North Carolina, Obsidian and Onyx was in West Virginia, Milk and Honey, Milk and Vine, no setting there, because they were poetry books. For Tomorrow took place in a fantasy setting. Love Comes in 3, setting wasn't mentioned. Goodnight Moon, setting wasn't mentioned. And Tempting the Best Man was in Washington, D.C. I read 9 books that were by authors who I have read their books before, and 6 of the books I read were by new-to-me authors. Going into ratings, so I had 2 1-star books, 2 3-star books, 7 4 stars, and 4 5 stars. Going into the readathons that I did this month, I participated in 4 readathons. That is a lot. That's basically a readathon every week. The first one was Tome Topple. I read 2 books for that. Then there was the Smudathon. I read 2 books for that. The Biannual Bibliothon. I read 1 book for that. And the 7 and 7 readathon. I read 7 books for that. I completed the challenge of reading 7 books in a week for that readathon, which is amazing. Out of the 13 books that were on my original TBR, I read 4 of them. At least I read some books from my original TBR, but that's not really good. So those are my stats, and that completes this video. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe down below for more bookish related videos. Also be sure to click that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that you are notified when I post new videos. And if you'd like to hear more from me outside of YouTube, be sure to follow my social media. Those links will be down in the description box. I'll be back really soon. Bye!